Welcome to Radical Engagements here at Vulgar. And we continue our discussion of Read on Authority by JudgeSabo. We are now in the section on Bakunin's notion of authority, and we will go through this accordingly. Federalism, Socialism, and Anti-Theologism, 1867. During this period, Bakunin had become active within the League for Peace and Freedom, an anti-war organization created in response to the Luxembourg crisis and the war between Austria and Prussia. This was primarily a bourgeois democratic organization, so had very little revolutionary potential. Marx and Engels bring this up later themselves. Still, he pulled a few people in a more radical direction. While he was unable to turn the organization itself to these ends, he was able to pull its membership away. And bring them into the First International. One of these attempts was Bakunin's Federalism, Socialism, Anti-Theologism, 1867, presented at their first Congress in Geneva. In this, he reframes the League's goal for, quote, a United States of Europe, along anarchist conceptions of federalism, which is, of course, anti-state, more properly speaking. Yes, it is anti-state, although Bakunin's anarchism and his federalism and his nationalism are still a little hazy in this time period, I think. Anyway, Bakunin recognizes this explicitly, saying that the United States Forum can never be formed from states as they are now constituted, by which he especially means the centralized state being necessarily bureaucratic and militarist, even if it were to call itself Republican, small r. Instead, Bakunin argued that the Congress of Geneva should proclaim, 5, that all members of the League should therefore bend all efforts towards reconstituting their respective countries in order to replace their old constitution, founded from top to bottom on violence and the principle of authority, with a new organization solely based upon interest, the needs, and the natural preferences of their populations, having no other principle than the free federation of individuals in the communes, of communes in the provinces, of provinces into nations, and finally of nations into the United States of Europe and the entire world eventually. Asterisk. Now, I want people to notice that there is a way in which both Marxism and this form of anarcho-communism or anarcho-collectivism, as Bakunin saw it. Sorry, I get my Russian B names overlap sometimes in my head. As Bakunin saw it, we can see that it actually extends from contradictions within liberalism itself, and goes much farther than that. And I think that's interesting to note even in Bakunin. While Bakunin is adopting his language for his audience, asterisk, sure, although I would love him to prove it, he is expressing the same idea of freedom, protecting the individual and collective liberty at each level of social organization. This view is in contrast to organizations founded from top to bottom and based on violence and the principle of authority. Bakunin clarifies his idea of the principle of authority a little later on. He therefore calls for rejecting the historic right of the state, emphasizing the autonomy of each level of organization as well as the right for them to disassociate. Principle 7, recognition of the absolute right of each nation, great or small, of each people, weak or strong, of each province, of each commune, to complete autonomy, provided its internal constitution is not a threat or a danger to the autonomy and liberty of neighboring countries. Asterisk, good luck with that last little caveat not being a big sticking point, Bakunin. 8, the fact that the country has been part of a state, even if it joined the state freely and of its own will, does not create an obligation for that country to remain forever attached. No perpetual obligation could be accepted by human justice. The only kind of justice that may have authority amongst us, and we shall never recognize other rights, are duties founded there upon liberty. The right of free union and of equally free secession is the first, most important of all political rights. The right without which federation would never be more than a centralization in disguise. So we see Bakunin's hostility to centralization and Marx and Engels' love of it. And I've already talked about the implications there within. I do want to note, for example, that the right of succession and of like smaller nationalities, principalities, etc., is actually contentious within Marxism, even though national autonomy is recognized. It is in no way clear that national autonomy was actually something that Marx and Engels really thought that much about, except that against big multinational empires like the British or the Habsburgs or the Prussians. Hard to see where that all goes, though. As we know, Bakunin is adopting his language to his audience. We understand that these sections in light of the other comments. By human justice, he means precisely the realization of freedom through equality. The authority here can clearly be distinguished from the other sense Bakunin is advocating against, which inherently implies unfreedom and inequality, which is especially clear from the overall context of the passage announcing the right of states and championing free association. I would agree with JudgeSabo on that. The limit placed on autonomy here is not threatening others is, again, ultimately no limit at all for Bakunin, since he sees freedom as being expanded by equal freedom of others rather than restricted by it. Which, yeah, I mean, Bakunin does see it that way. Whether it is that way, one way or the other, it really does depend. Is freedom for wolves, death to sheep, as Isaiah Berlin used to ask. The ideas of disassociation and succession in the 1860s call to mind the context of the American Civil War and the Confederacy. Unsurprising, while Bakunin is sympathetic to the idea of succession in abstract, he has little love for this state fighting for slavery, seeing this flaw as demolishing any other virtue that it might have had. Still, he is not uncritical of the northern states and the capitalist system they look to replace slavery with, which he argues is replacing explicit slavery with de facto slavery. So people want to throw this at Marx have to throw it at Bakunin and other 19th century radicals in Europe too. By this I mean that saying that de facto slavery is the same as chattel slavery is itself racist. I hear this a lot, and I think there's some truth to it, but it's an endemic theme in radicals in Europe the entirety of this time period. The internal political organizations of the southern states was, in certain respects, even freer than that of the northern states. It was only that in this magnificent organization of the southern states there was a black spot, just as there was a black spot in the republics of antiquity. The freedom of their citizens was founded upon the forced labor of slaves. This was sufficient to overthrow the entire existence of these states. Citizens and slaves, as such antagonism in the ancient world, as enslaved states of the New World, citizens and slaves, that is, forced laborers. Slaves not de jure, but de facto, not in law, but in fact, such as in the antagonism in the modern world. And just as ancient states perished through slavery, modern states will likewise perish through the proletariat. Did the ancient states perish through slavery? I don't know if a slave revolt's actually what ended Rome. Or that serfdom's what ended manorial and feudalism, etc. There's a lot of assumptions in this. Although I do think it's interesting what Bakunin is arguing about confederation here. Later in the speech, Bakunin presents a more detailed critique of the state, especially as it is presented by the French philosopher Rousseau, in his defense of democratic states governed by the sovereignty of the general will. Bakunin criticizes this era as illusory, denying the people the ability to manage their own affairs while also assuming they're capable enough to elect people to rule over others. If the people really were so prudent and just, they could just be trusted with this, that there would be no need for the state. If it were reduced down only to its essential function, losing its political character, as Engels might term it, to become a sort of central accounting bureau at the service of society. This stands in contrast with the defenders of what the state actually view it as. They implicitly view the masses as stupid, ignorant, and incompetent, needing some people of superior intelligence to rule over them like sheep. And we see this actually in the Federalist Papers. When they talk about democracy and confederation, they actually are critiquing the general public. In this critique, Bakunin gives a much clearer sense of what he means by the principle of authority. Any logical and straightforward theory of the state is essentially founded upon the principle of authority. That is, the eminently theological, metaphysical, and political idea that the masses, always incapable of governing themselves, must at all times submit to the beneficent yoke of wisdom and of justice upon them, in some way or another from above, imposed in the name of what and by whom. Authority which recognized and respected as such by the masses can come through three sources only: force, religion, the action of superior intelligence. As we discussed the theory of the state founded upon the free contract, we must propose the discussion of states founded on the dual authority of religion and force, and for the moment confine our attention to authority based upon superior intelligence, which, as we know, is always represented by minorities, aka, as in Madison's treatise in the Federalist Papers, rich minorities. That's the minority of which Madison wished to protect. And I would have no doubt that Bakunin is referring to that here, although I don't know that. The principal authority is the idea behind it, justifying authority as actually practiced and exercised. Essentially, this idea is that the people, incapable of ruling themselves, need to be ruled from above. This power can be exercised in various different ways, and through theories of state may try to justify it in different ways. Still, we are left with some minority putting itself above the masses. This includes a democratic state supposedly ruled by the social contract or free contract, but which really turns out to be this kind of technocratic justification. Bakunin is rather critical of democratic government, but he's also careful to point out this does not mean that he prefers monarchy. In fact, he criticizes democratic governments as superior. However, the basis of this superiority is the degree in which people can exercise freedom against these governments. Long quote from Bakunin. Let no one think that in criticizing the democratic government, we thereby show our preference for the monarchy. We are firmly convinced that most imperfect republic is 1,000 times better than the most enlightened monarchy. In the republic, there is at least brief periods when the people, while constantly exploited, is not oppressed, and monarchy's oppression is constant. The democratic regimes also lift the masses up gradually to participation in public life, something the monarchy never does. Nevertheless, while we prefer the republic, we must recognize and proclaim that whenever the form of government may be, so long as human society continues to be divided into different classes as a result of the hereditary inequality of occupations, of wealth, of education, and of rights, there will always be a class-restricted government and the inevitable exploitation of the majorities by the minorities. The state is nothing but this dominion, and this exploitation, well regulated and systematized. This gives us a clear view of Bakunin's understanding of the nature of the state. Dominion and exploitation are essential and defining features, but now at systemic levels. Both Engels and Bakunin seem to view the state as something fundamentally tied to class or class restricted, but Bakunin seems to believe that the state, working on its principle of authority, is inherently tied to an exploiting class, while the minority ruling over the majority. For him, the state is nothing but regulated and systematized exploitation and dominion. For Marx and Engels, the fighting force the workers create to combat the exploitation and dominion is also a state or a revolutionary dictatorship. Even they recognize the differences between this kind of state and others, though, and later moved away from calling this type of organization a state at all. That's why they call it the dictatorship of the proletariat, to get away from the cognitive state. But they realize as long as there is a need for a dictatorship of a class exists, and thus class abolition has not occurred. All right. What Marx and Engels think is by universalizing that class and giving that class right to rule, but moving everyone into it, thus the makers of society can be the runners of society, and there's no need for a state at all because you no longer need armed people to protect the classes. You might need armed people to protect the working class from both internal and external enemies, however, in the transition to setting that up and proletarianizing everybody. Additionally, Bakunin appears to the present state as the consequence of class divisions. He says, so long as human society constitutes to be divided into different classes, there must be class-based government. Class division is therefore what necessitates the state. Engels, Marx, and even Lenin agree with this, by the way. Recall that in his letter to Kuno, Engels accuses Bakunin of believing the opposite, saying that Bakunin maintains that the state, which has created capital, that the capitalist has his capital only by favor of the state. At least here, this is not the case. I think it would be interesting to see when we're referring to Bakunin's work here, because I don't know that he's entirely consistent on that. I just don't know. If Marx and Engels were to take issue with any of Bakunin's points, I believe it would be over him saying that these class divisions are a result of hereditary inequality. While this is a component of class, as Marx would agree, Bakunin puts far more emphasis on it. They would rather they would had a rather intense and public disagreement on this point, which is almost entirely ignored in the modern discourse about the two. All right, and we're going to look at this. This conflict especially came to a point at the Basel Congress of the First International. Marx took Bakunin's call for the abolition of inheritance in the program of the allegiance as an argument that social revolution needed to start with this abolition. Bakunin made no such claim. Against this imagined position, Marx argues that inheritance laws, like all judicial realities, were a consequence of economic basis of society and could only be abolished by attacking that basis. Calling to start social revolution with the abolition of inheritance would therefore be false in theory and reactionary in practice. Against this, Bakunin agreed that judicial laws arise out of economic base, but as that these laws then become the basis for reinforcing and expanding these economic systems, the fight against inheritance is therefore a necessary part of the fight against the economic base. In the end, the Congress did not accept either Marx or Bakunin's position, but while Bakunin simply failed to win the absolute majority due to a large number of abstentions, Marx's proposal was actively voted against. For more, see the First Socialist Schism. Bakunin might also disagree with Marx on what he sees as a symbiotic relation between the class and the state. While he agrees with Marx that class divisions produce the state and may even be its origin, he also more heavily emphasizes the way in which the state reproduces and reinforces class divisions. This happens not only by the very fact that a privileged part of the population is set up as rulers, but also in the practice of ruling corrupts and solidifies these relations into class relations. The solidification tends to be the point of focus for Bakunin and helps explain his emphasis on inheritance, which solidifies the relationship over generations from birth. I mean, Bakunin's got a point. This is also a debate between Marx and Henry George in America, so it came up a lot. Right? Bakunin argues that, supposing there was some society that believed that it could not manage its own affairs and needed rulers, then some small part of the population would be selected from among them with the personal capacities, talents, interests, and circumstances that made them best to rule. Thus, we have a division between the masses who submit themselves to those officials they elected and the small minority of people selected for being the most exceptional among them. Equality between people in this case could not be maintained. A majority of people, through the practice of governing, would develop in ways and come to view themselves as fit to govern, having already been assumed to be elected for their superiority. Quote, "Nothing is as dangerous as man's personal morality as his habit of commanding. The best of men, the most intelligent, unselfish, generous, and pure, will always and inevitably be corrupted in this pursuit." One can hear this even in like Cardinal Newman or Lord Acton or even conservative liberals. Anyway, the two feelings inherent in the exercise of power never fail to produce this demoralization, contempt for the masses and for the man in power, an exaggerated sense of his own self-worth. Notice that Bakunin actually focuses a lot more on interpersonal psychology in a way that I actually think is kind of a weak point for Marx. From this, they will act in ways to reproduce and entrench their power. Bakunin's critique of authority here is not merely moral, but practical, because the actual kind of society it produces. The moral corruption that comes with it is one that directly produced by material social relations. The moral system Bakunin advocated for, and therefore argued for the kind of social system required for it, and which creates it, is built on respect for humanity. Quote, "All human morality," and we shall try further on to prove the absolute truth of this principle, the development, explanation, and wildest applications of which constitute a real subject of this essay, all collective and individual morality rests essentially upon respect for humanity. What do we mean by respect for humanity? We mean the recognition of human right and human dignity in every man of whatever race, color, degree of intellectual development, and even morality. Now, I'm going to add, Bakunin wasn't consistent on this. He was an anti-Semite, among other things. But here there's a universalist tendency. This respect for humanity is exactly as it says, extended to all humanity, irrespective of race. This is not to say Bakunin consistently practiced this. Far from it, as Bakunin was an anti-Semite. Thank you, JudgeSabo. He would denounce certain individuals for being Jewish, stereotype them as wealthy bankers, and then tended to treat them collectively as a single unit engaged in a conspiracy to control the world through commerce. He would see this in his general conflicts with certain Jewish individuals, such as with Karl Marx and Nikolai Yutin, a conflict with Jews in general. The clear racism from Bakunin is disgusting, unjustifiable, and entirely incompatible with his explicitly stated principles. Bakunin was a self-contradictory figure, denouncing racism and colonialism and championing the self-determination of minorities in one breath, then to turn around and write off an entire ethnicity. I highly recommend Zoe Baker's Bakunin Was a Racist, which details the various incidents of Bakunin's anti-Semitism, its relationship to his overall thought and argument, and its relationship to the rest of the anarchist movement then and now. I mean, Bakunin actually kind of invented the Judeo-Bolshevik conspiracy theory, which blames Jews for both communism, or at least for both Marxism and for capitalism. He's not the only person to invent it. They actually developed concurrently. Zoe Baker is really good on this point. Anarchism might ideologically champion human liberation, but by no means perfectly embodies it, and throughout its history has had to deal with internal racism, colonialism, sexism, homophobia, and so on. This must not be whitewashed. Well, there's a great deal of insight which can be learned from studying socialists of the past. Our commitment remains first to the emancipation itself, to truth, justice, and morality as the basis of our conduct towards each other and towards all men without regard to color, creed, and nationality. General rule of the Working Men's Association. Bakunin himself did not expect anarchists to become Bakunists. If we follow men and not ideas that emphasize against any expert, we must reserve the right to criticize and to verify. Returning back to federalism, socialism, and anti-theologism, Bakunin holds that respect for humanity should be extended to all, including the genuinely wicked. Yeah, this is different than Marx. He believed that we can and should respect others this way, even if we need to defend ourselves against them with violence. Quote, "But if this man is stupid, wicked, or contemptible, can I respect him? Of course. If he is all that, it is impossible for me to respect his villainy, his stupidity, and his brutality. They are repugnant to me and arouse my indignation. I shall, if necessary, take the strongest measure against them, even going so far as to kill him if there's no other way of defending against him my life, my right, or whatever I hold precious and worthy. But even in the midst of the most violent and bitter, even mortal combat between us, I must respect his human character. My own dignity as a man depends on it." This respect for humanity shaped Bakunin's thought on how we should respond to antisocial behavior. He was not opposed to violence, even killing someone when necessary as a matter of self-defense. Outside of these cases where violence is necessary, he did not think that even the wicked person should be mistreated. Out of his respect for their humanity, he supported rehabilitative justice. This too extends to his materialist understanding of humanity and the way in which we are shaped by our social conditions and environment. Yeah, and Bakunin's actually pretty good on this. Long quote. "Nevertheless, if he himself fails to recognize this dignity in others, we must recognize it in him. If he is a sort of ferocious beast, or, as sometimes happens, worse than a beast, would we not, in recognizing his humanity, be supporting a mere fiction? No, for whatever his present intellectual and moral degradation may be, if organically he is neither an idiot nor a madman, in which case he should be treated as a sick man rather than as a criminal. If he is in full possession of his senses, and as such intelligence as nature has granted him, his humanity, no matter how monstrous his deviations might be, must nonetheless really exist. It exists as a lifelong capacity to rise to the awareness of his humanity, even if there should be little possibility of radical change in the social conditions which made him what he is. Take the most intelligent ape with the finest disposition. Though you place him in the best, most humane environment, you will never make a man of him. Asterisk, that's not true. An asterisk. The most hardened criminal are the man with the poorest mind, provided that neither has an organic lesion causing idiocy or insanity. The criminality of this one or the failure of the other to develop awareness of his humanity and his human duties is not their fault, nor is it due to their nature. It is solely the result of the social environment in which they were born and brought up. I would actually note that Marx does not go so far as to say that human beings do not have innate natures. He seems to think they are conditioned and limited by their material conditions, and which is primarily economic in nature. But he does not seem to think that there is no innate differences between individuals, and that's actually something he brings up in Critique of the Goethe Program, amongst many other places. We're going to stop here. I want to thank my patrons. You can like and subscribe. With my patrons, we're able to continue doing this. I have many levels patronage starting at $3 for audio, $5 for audio and additional video, and $10 for audio, video, a vote and direction. Sometimes the ability to request a patron-only show or to be in a patron-only show, depending on what one wants. That's the $10 level. And $10 patrons get a shout out, and I have one to give, or two to give. That would be Evan W. And Edril M. And Brandon L. Okay, I think that's everybody. So apparently there was 3 to give. I'd like to thank my Cohost, who help guide my work, sometimes help me select text for radical engagements, select books for the book club, ask me questions during Q&A, although every patron gets to ask me questions during the Q&A, etc. You also get access to my Discord, which has 5 different reading groups running in it. Basically run a reading group machine over there. And you enable me to provide most of this material for free to the general public. Thank you. I don't do merch, but I do occasionally wear other YouTubers' merch. This is from Justin Sledge of Esoterica fame. Big fan of his show. Maybe one day he'll be on. Got to ask him, though. But I don't make my own merch. I'm not a merch dude. So just, nor do I. I have not as of yet, and I'm still not considering it, monetizing my YouTube channel, because while it would probably increase my place in the algorithm, it would also open me up to being demonetized and potentially censored, whereas now all I have to do is meet the community standards, which basically consists of not lying too much and not threatening people. And on that note, goodbye. See you soon.